One thing that I've always been fascinated with is our ability to make fun of politicians. We have kind of uniquely in the world the right to say what we want about our politicians. I have been collecting for a long time, but one thing that I've always wanted to do is understand the context of how the larger culture thinks about its leaders. And humor is a great way of doing that. So if you look at, for instance, the bills that are in there that have pictures of the different presidents, often that was making fun of their economic policies. You'll notice that some of the dollars are bigger, some of the dollars are smaller. That sort of depends upon how the larger culture was looking at them at any given time. So we have George Bush with small dollars and Bill Clinton with big dollars and whatever the case might be. And it's simply because the way that we're making fun of our politicians, which I think is just wonderful opportunity that we have in a free society. So that's a big part of my focus as a collector. The years from the 60s to the 70s were really complex in terms of a transition from sort of the old world to the new world. And it's the period when, particularly after World War II, when the United States was finding itself in the larger cultures of other societies as well. But we were finding ourselves as well. And there was an amazing explosion of different political philosophies that were popping up during that period. And that resulted in a huge number of candidates in both the Republican and the Democratic parties that were trying to latch on to these sort of different understandings of what it meant. I love the variety of stuff that the 1960s and 70s provide. Now, one thing that's interesting about the 60s is we had a couple of candidates then and a couple of politicians who had really, I mean, I guess all presidents have big egos, but had amazingly big egos. And one of them was Lyndon Johnson, who I have a signed photograph in there, which I'm particularly proud of. But you will notice with his items in particular that there are several that are just really huge because it was his ego. I'm Lyndon Johnson, I'm a tall man, I'm a big man, and I control everything, right? And I've always thought that was pretty fascinating about him, particularly in terms of his personality. But again, there's this wonderful variety of different politicians that pop up during that period. And I've got a whole lot of pins from a large number, particularly on the Democratic side, of folks that were trying to latch on to these different constituencies, these different beliefs, these different ideologies that made up America sort of trying to find itself through that period. Two of my favorite presidents were the Roosevelts. FDR was, of course, the president from 1932 to his death in 1945, and that represented 4 terms, and therefore he had a lot of time to produce a lot of different sort of political items. Some of them were sort of your traditional, pictures of the president, pictures of the vice president. By the way, if you have a picture of a president and a vice presidential candidate on a pin together, that's called a Juget. And among collectors of pins, particularly, Jugets are the ones that are most favored. And they tend to be the most expensive if you're buying. I try not to buy retail very often. But because he was president for 4 terms and he had a different vice president each term, there are at least 4 different Jugets for Roosevelt. I do not have all 4. I only have a couple of them. Some of them particularly rare. But as you move from the 1930s and the focus on the Depression, and there's some items in there that sort of relate to, the NRA, the National Recovery Act, toward the latter part of his term from 40 and 44, where it became more focused on World War II, you'll also tend to see more of an emphasis on things like national defense. And I try and have a range of all of those different kinds of things, and I think that's reflected in there pretty well. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic through the 1950s, many of our presidents were military leaders. And one era where that was most pronounced was the era from the Civil War to the McKinley era in 1900. And many of the leaders in that period were members of the Republican Party, and in particular, a focus of the Republican Party at that point was something called the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a Civil War veteran veterans organization, but was also really closely in line with the Republican Party, because at that point, the Republican Party were viewed as the loyal Americans. The Democratic Party was viewed kind of still as associated with the South, and therefore the disloyal Confederate. Most of the items in there are associated with these Republican presidential victors who'd been part of the Grand Army of the Republic and Civil War veterans. I mentioned I had a couple of eras, people that were my heroes. Roosevelt was one. Another one was Ulysses Grant. Now he's viewed as a better president than he was for a lot of our history. He had a lot of bad associations with people who tended to rip off the government, which we see from time to time in history. I have a couple of items in there that were U.S. Grant items. Particularly, there are these little photographs. They're about this big. They're called cartavistas. As photography became both popular but cheaper in the years after the Civil War in particular, people were able to get photographs of themselves printed up in these little things called cartavistas, and they would give them out to people. And they're, I've got a couple of examples at home of entire books that are just page after page after page after cartavista. But there are a couple of those in there related to U.S. Grant and to Lincoln, because those were not only photographs that could be handed to people, but they were also used as political items as well. So you could give somebody a cartavista if you were supportive of a particular candidate. So I think those are pretty neat as well. I have a couple of weird items in there that I think are pretty fun. I have some of Mary Lincoln's hair in the exhibit. It is as authentically verified as it could be. It was purchased not by me but by somebody else from a pretty credible auction house. Cutting hair and giving hair to people was a pretty popular thing to do. The Billy beer, I drank Billy beer. I started college in 1977, and at that time the drinking age was 18, and Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. So in 1977, Billy beer was a fairly prominent item in most beer stores, right? Terrible, absolutely terrible beer. But we drank it on campus. It was cheap, it was awful, and it was supportive of our president.